Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Boards. I'm Don Kaiser, Executive Vice President of Virtual Inc. Today, our speakers will provide you with practical tips and strategies on how you can make your board more successful, covering areas from board composition to best practices for meetings. You'll leave with ideas you can implement right away to help your board and your organization's overall success. Our speakers are Andy Freed and Lisa Myers. As Virtual CEO, Andy oversees the company's client teams along with the organization's overall service quality and management practices. He has more than 20 years of experience working with associations, nonprofits, and political organizations. And he has managed a wide range of entities from small startups to multi-million-dollar organizations with members spread throughout the globe. With Virtual for the past 18 years, Andy previously served as Vice President and CIO of the Massachusetts Hospital Association and currently serves on the organization's board, as well as the Board of Overseers of Wellforce Healthcare. He is a graduate of Harvard University and received his master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Lisa Myers is a strategic visionary for associations. With a deep background in association management, she works with clients to develop operational plans that help them optimize their potential. In over 40 years as an association executive, she has developed a passion and expertise for helping associations achieve their missions by reaching beyond their geographic borders. Lisa is currently the CEO of the Academy of Eating Disorders in her role as Senior Director at Virtual Inc. She has previously served as a CEO of the Electronic Retailing Association and the Partnership for Prevention, as well as helped literally hundreds of associations to strengthen their governance process and their strategic orientation. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. However, questions can be asked at any time using the GoToWebinar chat function. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If we are unable to get to your question in that time, don't hesitate to email us at info@virtualinc.com. This webinar is being recorded, and the video and slides will be posted on the Virtual website Knowledge Hub soon, and we will be sending an email to all of you once they are live. At the conclusion of the webinar, please take a few moments to complete the survey that will pop up in your window. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Andy Freed.
Don, thanks so much. I will say I appreciate the intro and listening to you give the bios. I was thinking, wow, I can't wait to hear this thing. I hope I learned something. But well, I guess now I've got a really high hurdle to get over. Well, appreciate folks being with us today, and wanted to start out with what brings me to this webinar today. And the reality is, I've got a secret I want to share with the world. How about that for something pretty exciting? And my secret is this. I go to over 100 board meetings per year. This isn't something I'm proud of. This isn't something that people really want to hear about at college reunions and cocktail parties, but it's true. I go to over 100 board meetings per year. And the reality is, most of the time, this is how I feel. I want to put my head down on the desk, perhaps curl up in the fetal position underneath, and just get myself out of there. Why is that? Well, the reality is this. So many board meetings consist of these 3 ingredients. The wrong people, talking about the wrong stuff, and taking too long doing it. So I got to thinking, what's the right way to do it? What's a better way you can do it?
Andy, I'm so glad you said that. I've never gotten this out of my mind. I did strategic planning for a great association that had a very important purpose. And as a part of the planning, I sat down with their board, and I am not making this up. They spent 23 minutes in a 3-hour board meeting arguing about whether they should serve turkey or ham sandwiches in the exhibit hall. I am not making that up. So this is a really important point.
No question. Sometimes you've got like that really smart people who just spend their time just on the wrong stuff. And that's just not where we want to be. So how do you do it right? Well, I got down and, had the chance to chat with Lisa, and I'm delighted to, at Virtual, have minds like Lisa's around just to sit and kibitz with things on. As Lisa and I were talking, we came up with, well, there's 7 things. And I'll confess, depending on my mood, sometimes this can be the 7 deadly sins of ineffective boards. But today we're feeling really optimistic. So it's the 7 habits of highly effective boards. And these are them. I'm not going to do the business karaoke and read them off to you. But if you're looking at the screen right now and saying, well, yeah, duh, these are all pretty obvious. Well, then already we are delivering value to you, because you're going to get an hour of your life back and not listen to the rest of this. But if you're looking at this and want to learn a little bit more, stick with us for a bit, and we'll walk through each one of these. So let me kick off with the first habit: getting the right people and dropping the dead wood. And it's the reality that to get the right people on the board, well, it's not everybody. You want to make sure that you've got some of the right people who are around. And I'll also say, as you're doing that, lots of boards have the wrong people, the people that have been there forever, the people that aren't delivering, they're just not delivering value. You need to think about how you get rid of them. Well, let's get into the pragmatic side of that. Who are these right people? I love diversity when it comes to board members, and somebody way smarter than me, even though I was probably supposed to read this book in college, I've now read it. Now that you do the reading, you discover why they assign it. But John Stuart Mill had this to say about diversity, that talking to dissimilar people and people who aren't like you, that's what makes boards work. Tom Peters, the management consultant, came up with this rule of, here's his list of what the ideal board looks like. A 10-person board of directors, 2 members under 30, 4 women, I'll keep, going up, no more than 2 people over 60. Lisa, does this sound like boards that you were around?
Well, it does, but I think that it doesn't happen by accident. You need to make it happen. And in fact, I would add to that superb list diversity in what each member does in the community. So for example, at AED, we represent physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, academic researchers. And when I see a board that's balanced with too many of any one person, any one type of person or any one profession, it makes me nervous. And we also seek to ensure that all their diverse perspectives are represented. And we are also consciously addressing personal identity groups. We're working hard on that, and it's not, ASAE has done a fantastic job of it, but it's hard work. Racial, religious, cultural, international, gender. It makes the nomination process really complicated, but it is possible, and it makes for much better thinking. And one more thing I'll say, and then I'll stop. A challenge for us in diversifying the board in the field is that there isn't a lot of diversity in our field. It tends to be a profession that has appealed to Anglo-Saxon men for the most part. And so we're consciously recruiting and cultivating individuals from minority groups into the field through university internships or otherwise. And at every single board meeting of AED, we'll probably stop someday when we get it right, but at every single board meeting, we include a 5 to 10 minute discussion on how we're doing. It isn't a lecture, but it's not a canned set of remarks, but it's a question that's put to the board. What have you seen that is helping to diversify AED and or the field? We're making progress slowly, but surely, but it's really an investment worth making, I think.
No, thanks, Lisa. And I think that kind of diversity and diversity of thinking and diversity of experience and diversity in every way, I would say there's a reason this is number one. And it comes from not thinking about having a governance committee, not thinking about having a nominating committee. Both of those put my feet to sleep. Think about having talent scouts. Who are people who are out there who are scouring the universe for the right board members for you, for people who are rock stars in what they do that you want to have join your group. Too many organizations focus on, well, we have a nominating committee And what are they going to do? They're going to pick the people who have served on our committees well, and maybe they have to put in like 5 or 10 years on a committee. Then they should be a committee chair for a few years. And then maybe we'll let them join the board after that 15 years later. Well, the problem with that is I've already now made it impossible to satisfy getting somebody under 30 on the board unless they started with your committees when they were 15 years old. And I've also lost the new eyes. I've also lost the idea of having somebody come to the board who really has a fresh perspective. Now, to make that a fresh perspective, you got to make room. And to make room, you got to get rid of the dead wood. And there's a lot of forms that dead wood comes in. There's this person gave lots of money, we got to keep them on the board. They're the founder, we got to keep them around. They're connected. You got to be willing to do that. And 4 practical strategies for that. 1, term limits do matter. And you can have term limits, but then also decide, well, we'll let this person stay on, but at least it gives you the chance to have the discussion about whether somebody has run their course on the board. Good standing requirements, that somebody has to attend a certain number of meetings, whether it's 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 6. Think about creating advisory roles so that you're not bumping somebody off the board, but you're bumping them to something else. And I will say, I watch lots of organizations get in trouble with former chairs that used to be really engaged and are now not. An advisory role is a great way to keep them involved. And lastly, just having frank discussions. You've got to be willing to sit down and talk to somebody and saying, we need to make some changes here. So all of that's important to create that opportunity.
On that, Andy, one thing that not necessarily for the longest standing, but we also have begun to use ex officio members who are members by virtue of office without vote. And you have to be careful because it's an easy way to fall into the trap of having one individual or 2 or 3 holding permanent forever seats on the board and eternally saying things like, we tried that and it didn't work, or that's not the way we do it, ugh. But there is a value in bringing voices to the table that may not be board voices, but who represent significant interests, who should be integrated in some way into the discussions. Maybe the ex officio members just attend 2 out of 6 board meetings or something. It needs to be controlled, but it has a value.
That's a great point, Lisa. So let me move to the next of our habits, which is minding the mission. And the reality is, when you think about minding the mission, it's really the most important thing that the board does. And for so many boards, if you ask them the question of who they are, you have to decide between the 2 people on this screen. And for those that are in the majority of Americans now, which is younger than me, let me explain who these folks are. On the left, you have Colin Powell. On the right, you have Norman Schwarzkopf. Colin Powell was once asked many, many years ago in the first Gulf War in 1991, he was asked about the mission, strategy, and tactics for Allied forces in the Gulf. And after a little bit of hemming and hawing, he said, well, you're talking about why are we doing this, and what are we doing, and how we're going to do it. And after thinking more, he said, well, I'll tell you, I can tell you the mission. Yep, our mission is to liberate Kuwait, and I can tell you the strategy. But when it comes to tactics, that's General Schwarzkopf's job. I don't do tactics. The problem for so many boards is they want to get into the tactics. And when they do that, guess what? If you're doing the tactics and not worrying about the mission, nobody is. And nobody's focused on the mission of the organization. And nobody's focused on the big picture. So back to Lisa's example, if you're worrying about ham or turkey, then that is the pinnacle of altitude for thinking for the organization, and nobody's thinking about the big picture. Wouldn't you say, Lisa?
Absolutely, absolutely. When I'm working with boards, I like to surprise them with the question. I like to ask them, tell me what the mission of the organization is without looking at any reference. Don't look it up, just tell me. And it's sometimes a stunning revelation that many on the board don't know. They kind of know, but they often leave out critical ideas or they throw in surprising peripheral thoughts. One of my favorite sayings about helping everyone be crystal clear on the vision is from Peter Drucker, the great leadership guru, and he said, your mission should fit on a t-shirt.
or these days ahead. What I would say is there's some practical strategies of this. One very simple one is on every board agenda, print your mission statement.
Great idea.
At least you're right that many boards can't even rattle off their mission statement. Have it on the board agenda, and if some point your mission seems anachronistic to what you're doing, it's time to start talking. Dartmouth College started out with the mission of educating the Native American population of northern New England. At some point, they said it's time to expand. The March of Dimes started out with the mission of stamping out polio. The Salk vaccine comes along. It's time to change. If the board's not looking at that, nobody is. Which brings us to our next challenge, which is focus. And for so many groups, having a focus is a real challenge. And you have groups that say, well, this is our mission, but that board member over there wants to do something, so we'll give it a shot. And this person has got something they want to do, so we'll try it. Well, I'm going to give you two people that don't agree on much to talk about this. One's Bill Gates. Bill Gates said that his success came from focusing on a few things. That's what it's all about. The other is Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs got back to Apple after his exile, the first thing he did was eliminate 90% of the product line and focus the organization down on a few things. I watch so many organizations that are trying to do too much because every project has it's somebody's project and we don't want to say no. Lisa, how have you seen groups say no and focus in on just the right things?
Well, it's really hard to do because there are all kinds of people, different board members have their pet projects and they just love to do this. I once worked with an association with 15 board members and 12 staff. And 12 staff is not small, but it's not large. And they had, and I'm not exaggerating, 140 separate programs that they were running. And nothing was being done well because they were trying to do too much. We developed a survey monkey and had the board and then the full membership rank each program against a set of criteria, including things like, do we have the appropriate human resources, competencies and technologies to manage this program? Or does this program really further our mission? Is it a priority in terms of this year's strategy plan? Is it something we're doing because it's important to a special constituency? Is there a lot of competition? Are we in the blue ocean or are we in the red ocean where everybody is competing to do the same thing? And does the value justify the cost and some other criteria? And we winnowed that list of 140 programs down to 12. And the association in the next year increased its revenue by 30%. And members were thrilled and excited. It was painful, but we did it. One of the things to help keep focused in the meetings too, I just thought I might mention now, if I have a new president or a secretary, so much of the focus in a meeting depends on the management of the presiding officer. And if I have a new president or a secretary, and I suspect that they have not done this a lot, they're not quite sure how to steer the conversation, I'll often actually write a script for them, which they can deviate from, but it is a word for word. Hi, thanks for coming today. Now, does anybody want to look at the consent calendar? And it seems to be very effective. For those that are new, it makes them feel very self-confident and keeps the meeting on track and moving. They're not thinking about, what do I do next? So just a couple of thoughts.
That's a great strategy. Thanks so much, Lisa. So next on the list, and it's kind of, to some extent, seems the opposite of focus, but it's also important, which is scanning the horizon, looking out there to see what's happening, making sure that as a board, you're spending some active time, both looking and seeing what's happening and listening as well, and listening to your members. Now, I watch a lot of groups struggle with this. So many board meetings I go to, the bulk of the agenda is reports. We're going to have committee reports. We're going to have, a whole series of reports and things coming into folks, and very little time spent looking outward and discussing your industry. So organizations tend to have some of the leading thinkers in their industry around if you're an association, and you're bringing those folks together to listen to reports and never talk about what's the big picture that's happening out there. Just talking as board members about what's keeping you up at night, what are the trends that you're seeing, what are you starting to do as organizations that you're members of. Just doing that as board members makes a huge difference to the success of the organizations. Wouldn't you say, Lisa?
I would completely. And on a mechanical basis, on a tactical basis, for AED to help cut down on the unnecessary chatter and the reading of endless reports, AED uses a three-part agenda. The first part of the agenda we call the consent calendar, and it's a list of items that members can approve collectively with no discussion and a single vote for all. Though any member can ask that an item on the consent calendar be moved to the discussion agenda, but if there isn't a lot to say important about an item, it just, with a single vote, they all get approved. The second part of the agenda is what we call an FYI agenda. It's a list of reports and information that keeps the board informed of issues that they should know about, but they don't need to discuss. Again, items can be removed for discussion, but they rarely are. And finally, the discussions agenda, which rarely has more than 3 items on it. We send the agenda at least a week before the meeting, and every discussion item is supported by a memo or a document or data that informs the discussion, as are the items in the consent calendar and the FYI agenda. And at the end of the discussion agenda, we do have an open item for new business, but more often than that, because people haven't come prepared to discuss it, we use that strictly to queue up a topic that will need discussion at the next meeting, or could become an item on the consent calendar for the next meeting.
No, that's great. And that's similar to, we have several boards we work with that the first standing item on the board agenda every time is a 30 or 45-minute environmental scan. What's happening out there? And what's interesting is I see so many boards that will have the whole board meeting will be about reporting, and then the more interesting conversation takes place in the bar after the meeting. That's when everyone starts talking about, hey, our entire industry is changing, by the way. And well, that would have been a great thing to talk about earlier in the board meeting. So speaking of changing, the next piece is so important, which is good boards embrace change. And good boards are all about embracing change and not resisting it. And 2 quotes I just love for this. One is Jack Welch from GE, the kind of the CEO of CEOs worldwide. And Jack said, when the rate of change outside exceeds the rate of change inside, the end is in sight. I love that quote. It's the idea of thinking that if you're not changing, and things are changing more on the outside, then the end is near for you. That comes from, and knowing that, and knowing what changes on the outside comes from what we talked about a moment ago, comes from doing the environmental scan. If the world is changing and you're not, you're going to be in trouble. And there's another gentleman, General Eric Shinseki from the Army, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs for some time, said, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. I couldn't agree with both of those more. That change is just so important. And Lisa said it earlier. Often you have boards that will say, well, we tried that 10 years ago. We're not going to try that again. We've always done it this way. Don't you understand? That's making sure that you're really embracing change. So how do you do it? You ask the hard questions.
Before you do that, Andy, I have one other favorite quote.
Please.
It's from Robin Sharma, who's a writer and a speaker, motivational, and not as well known as your incredible luminaries, but very profoundly thoughtful guy. And he said, change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous at the end. And I honestly think that it is hard work. It's so much easier to talk about ham versus turkey sandwiches or other irrelevant and minor tactical things. It's hard to talk about the hard stuff, but oh my gosh, it's rewarding at the end when you actually bring about meaningful, productive change for your industry or profession.
No, you're right. And it's not just hard to talk about it, but it's also hard to be the board that forces that change. It's a lot easier just to go along and say, we've always done it this way, and be a board member that just says, well, we'll just keep doing that. But it's a lot harder to be a board member that changes things. And, change comes from a few places. It comes from asking hard questions. Are we in the right business still? Back in the 90s, Sports Illustrated was committed that they were in the magazine business. That's what they did. Well, ESPN said, well, we're in the sports information business. Thank you very much. We're going to have a website, and we're going to have we're going to have a bunch of TV channels, and eventually, what do they have? A magazine. And they almost ate Sports Illustrated lunch in the process. So are we still in the right business? Asking the wrong people. That's what we talked about earlier about diversity. Asking people from all over the organization. Learning from everywhere. That comes from the environmental scan. It's not just, you'll see lots of folks that will think about one thing for their association and forget the trends they see elsewhere. I remember one speaker we had come in years ago to a bunch of hospital CEOs who asked them two questions. How many of you go to the internet for healthcare data? Every hand went up. How many of you go to your hospital's website for healthcare data? Every hand went down. And he said, well, worry when your behavior as a CEO is different than your behavior as a consumer. Mm-hmm. So it's great advice. Failing, being willing to try new things and fail at them. Not every change works. And lastly, don't wait for the members. It's the old quote from Henry Ford that if you'd waited for the customers, they would have asked them for a faster horse. Lots of associations are in the faster horse department. Wouldn't you say, Lisa?
Absolutely, absolutely. The only thing I will say is that in order to keep, as Alice said, or the Cheshire Cat said to Alice, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. There needs to be some order and structure and intentionality to the association's direction, which doesn't mean that it should, because it's on a path, it should keep going there if it's the wrong path. It definitely does not mean that. But one of the tools that we use very effectively at AED to keep the order that allows us to radically change both internally and seek to change the outside is a tightly indexed policy and procedures manual that's updated as needed on the fly, but also reviewed systematically every 3 years. Ours is 287 pages now. Codifying our policies helps everyone remember what has already been decided and keeps board members and other volunteers from having the same conversations, making the same decisions over and over and over and over again. I also feel very strongly that procedures, the how something will be done, including things like pricing, transaction processing, and other administrative functions, are procedure, not policy. And procedure is best designed and defined by those who are carrying out the procedure. Policy is the board work. Procedure is the staff work. And when you get a board endlessly debating, well, can we have a 5% dues increase? Something is wrong. They're focused on the wrong subjects. They're not looking at.
No, I agree.
Yep.
And Lisa, it's almost like you've looked at these slides because structure is so important in all of this. Structure, as you described, structure that actually works is what you're talking about. It's structure where you know what your policies do and know what your procedures do. And, I watch a lot of baseball, and you don't see this very often. Two infielders crash into each other for the same ground ball, because infielders really know which side the ball, who's going for the ball based on where it's hit to and what the situation is. They understand that. What you just described was policies and procedures that make it clear that folks should know, here's who goes to the ball, here's what you're doing for things. And that comes to knowing roles and responsibilities. It also comes to accountability and having a sense of here's the way things work, and holding people accountable for doing it that way, for having bureaucracy that makes sense. It's not bureaucracy just for the sake of doing things. There shouldn't be bureaucracy in an organization. There should be things that streamline. It's just what Lisa was talking about a moment ago. Having rules that go beyond the bylaws. So many organizations, they have a bylaws and that's about it. Having policies that are documented, that's having structure that works. And not having some things in the bylaws is really important as well. Modifying bylaws is really hard. Lawyers make a lot of money doing that. And there's a time that you want to do it, but there are other things that you don't want to have in that process. It's looking at your committee chairs, getting an idea of are committee chairs doing things right? And lastly, it's looking at all this stuff all the time. When I came to the Mass Hospital Association in 1996, one of my first jobs was to take a look at their bylaws. And when I reviewed their bylaws, I discovered that the way we were supposed to notify members of all board meetings was by telegraph. As it turns out, we hadn't been doing that very much, but nobody had taken the time to read it. So looking at all your processes makes a lot of sense. So your processes allow for electronic voting. Do they allow for things that just make sense the way people work today?
One of the cool things that we use is is what we call a rapid vote. Occasionally between board meetings, particularly in the area of public policy, an urgent issue comes up and we can't just say, okay, well, we'll put it on the board agenda next July. We need a decision now. So we do use between board meetings, single issue rapid votes for which every board member has to vote. They don't have to have 100% agreement. It's majority rule, but every board member has to cast a vote so that they've had the opportunity to speak. But it's done overnight by email and it's very effective.
No, it's a great idea, and it's so important to have structures like that that are quick. There are groups that we work with that there's one group that I've been advising, they have semi-annual board meetings. I can't think of that many things I do in life that are important that I say, and I'm just going to do this twice per year. Where their problem is something will come up, they'll talk about it at the board meeting, some good questions will be raised. Say, great, let's answer those questions in 6 months, and then we'll have some follow-ups. That's a great way to get nothing done. What you're describing, Lisa, with having rapid vote, doing things between meetings, that's structure that works. That's what we want. And the last of our habits is evaluate yourself. Make sure that as a board, you're doing self-evaluations. Take a look at, it's very common for folks to evaluate conferences and to evaluate programs. Well, heck, we might even evaluate this webinar. But people forget to evaluate board meetings. After every single board meeting, do an evaluation. How'd we do? Do regular check-ins with folks who aren't on the board. Talk to members about how they think the board, how well the board reflects their organization. And I'll also say retreats with facilitators, having somebody from the outside who can help you discuss things is really, really valuable and helps you deliver the next level of looking at what the board's doing and what the board's not doing. Some questions I love on meeting evaluations are pretty simple. I love the questions of, are we prepared? So many board meetings I go to these days, there's pre-reads, and then the board meeting winds up being a dramatic reading of the pre-reads. Well, that's not a meeting. If we're prepared, we've already read the pre-reads and we can just have discussion. Sticking to agenda, sticking to the time frame is important. But the next one, we left parochialism at the door. I know that this is one, Lisa, you've struggled with at times of getting folks to forget who they represent, but really talk about the organization as a whole.
Absolutely. We do tend to have, for example, we have patient carers, people who are themselves patients or carers. We typically have one representative on the board, and they are so driven in a wonderful, passionate way about expressing their point of view. But we have to remind them that, okay, when you're sitting at the board table, you've got to look at the organization as a whole. You see this a lot with associations that represent geographic areas where they'll get stuck on representing their constituency in a particular chapter or geographic area. And the one other thing that I feel so strongly about, I always begin my board year every year with a reminder to my board members that they don't have to agree with every decision that the board makes. But when they walk out of that board meeting, they have two choices. One, they can support the board decision that was made, or they can resign from the board. But you can't have parochialism. You can't have people saying, we discussed that in the board and those idiots just didn't understand what I was trying to say. No. When the board acts, you must support what the board does, or if you can't, you should leave the board.
I absolutely agree with that, Lisa. That's so destructive when somebody acts with the dissenting opinion publicly. That doesn't help the organization. It doesn't help anybody. And that's something that's just so important. So with that, taking our own advice and sticking to the timeframes on the agenda, we come to the end of our 7 habits. And as a reminder, these are them. It's getting the right people. It's minding the mission, focusing on things, looking outside, embracing change, creating structure that works, and doing self-evaluations. As a reminder, I'm Andy. That's Lisa. We have faces and pictures too. That's what this slide proves. We're pretty excited about that. And we'd love now to take your questions. If you've got questions, you can type them into the chat window. I'll also say, if questions come to you later, feel free to drop us a line. My direct email and direct line are on the screen. Drop me a line anytime. I'm happy to convince about these or other questions around boards and organizations. Sadly, this is what I do for fun. So, Don, what do we have for questions?
Yes. Andy and Lisa, thank you very much. That was very informative. We do have a number of questions. You stress getting the right people and getting rid of the dead wood. But on a practical basis, how do you do it? Nominating committees insist on being independent.
Yeah, I think it's important to have the nominating committee have a sense of the mission and a sense of something broader of what the organization is trying to accomplish. Wouldn't you say, Lisa?
Absolutely. That goes for every committee. For many years, I sat as a junior staffer, I sat in on as a staff liaison to so many committees where they didn't really understand what they were expected to do, what was required of them, and they were just, there was so much time wasted at the board, but there's time wasted at the committee level. The committees should be driving the agenda of the board. I don't mean creating the agenda for the board, but I mean supporting what the board is trying to do. So a board needs to be very clear with the nominating committee. This is not a personality contest. This is not a reward for years of service. We're trying to get the best voices with the best insight from the widest possible interest in the field. And it may take a year or 2 years or 3 years to turn the committee attitude and to turn the board attitude, but it's so rewarding. It's so worth doing.
Here's another question. You all had stressed the importance of diversity on a board. The question is, how do you ensure diversity when a board is elected and not appointed?
I think some of it, well, I'll lead off. I think some of it is making sure that the right people are even standing for election, and taking a look at just, getting folks involved and encouraging people to run. I was talking with somebody earlier who's being encouraged to run for a local school committee, and that this is a practical example. Is an example of a community that's reaching out to somebody who they think is the right person to stand on the ballot. They can't control whether or not he or she wins, but they can, get that person to run and get that person to throw their hat in the ring, whether, when they might not have been thinking of it before. But sometimes also you can have a hybrid structure where you can have an elected board that also has a balance of a handful of appointed seats that are geared to create that diversity. What have you seen, Lisa?
Well, one other phenomenon, I have to look up the statistic. I'm not sure how prevalent this is, but I think it's fairly common. We have a mechanism to allow for a contested election. So if somebody wants to put forward a candidate to the nominating committee, they may do so. But in AED, the nominating committee comes up with a slate of candidates, and in my tenure, that slate has always been a single candidate slate per seat, which doesn't mean that more people can't jump into the fray if they wish to be considered. And then the membership votes to elect them as a whole. I can see how that could be sort of a self-perpetuating But again, if you keep the board and the nominating committee focused on the challenge of bringing new voices, new faces, new ideas into the board, and if everybody can get excited about that, then I think that it can work. There's one other thing about a contested ballot, a contested slate. I was at a meeting of a very large national professional society, and they had 3 or 4 candidates for each seat on the board of directors, each open seat. And each of those board candidates stood up in front of the membership with an audience of 3,000-4,000 people and made the case for why, like the elections that we're about to go through, made the case for why they were an ideal candidate. And there was something really nice and democratic about that. On the other hand, I couldn't help but really feel sad for the candidates who were not elected after having stood up in front of their peers and stood out. I'm probably wrong and off base about that. It won't be the first time, but I really like.
You're okay to feel bad. That's fair.
Okay, and I really like the idea.
That's certainly fair.
Yeah.
Don, we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah. Do you encourage board orientation annually as a reminder for the entire board or just for new members before they join?
Lisa, do you want to lead off this time?
I'd love to. I will say that we do board orientation for the full board every year. It's tight, it's scripted, it's PowerPointed, and we do one other thing that is related to the orientation. We actually have a board and staff contract that defines reporting relationships and behaviors, everything from please don't use your cell phone during the meetings. You know, if you have emergency, get up and walk out, but please focus and come prepared. And it isn't that the contract is some legal binding thing. I suppose it is on some planet, but the benefit of it is that we are asking board members consciously and specifically to think about what their responsibilities are that they're taking on. And people tend to think hard when they're going to sign something. If they're going to sign a contract, they think hard about it. And that has worked very well for us.
Yep, and I would completely agree with you, Lisa, that I think that, you know, the reality of doing board training every year, things change. And, you know, new things come up in terms of how boards act, new laws come up, new ways of interacting come up, and it's important to keep folks informed on all of those norms and the things that do work well.
And it is that opportunity to remind them when they're sitting at the board table, they are looking out at the interests of the membership in its entirety and not at their personal agenda. And things like when the board makes a decision, we all stand behind it, or unless we have to choose to withdraw, and all of those things. It makes it, you can remind them of those things in a setting that is not a crisis, where somebody has done it, you have to call them on it, although that happens too.
Absolutely.
Lisa and Andy, a lot of the slides and the discussion was centered on change. How do you get a board of directors that might be stuck to embrace the notion of change?
A couple of things. First, I'll say I do love the idea of bringing in folks from the outside. And I think sometimes it's hard for a chair to do that themselves because we're a facilitator, and having a retreat can really help in that process. Environmental scans and looking outward is so important. If a board can really understand, here's how the world is changing without them, you know, that can matter. Lisa, what else have you seen?
Well, you addressed it earlier, but it's worth saying again. When I'm doing strategic planning with associations, I almost always go out to the full membership with a questionnaire, asking them a lot of open-ended questions, and I generally get a really good response from it. And often there will be things that 2 or 3 board members have thought of that need to change, but they think, oh, I don't know, it'd be too controversial. And when you begin to hear the voices from the membership itself, listening, and then the other thing that you talked about, which could not be emphasized enough, is the scanning of the horizon. What's your competition doing? What is the New York Times saying about your field? What's going on out there is extraordinarily important. And it's actually fun work once you kind of get everybody oriented to thinking and working that way.
I think we have time for one more. I think we have time for one more question. This involves committees and boards. The question is, we have committees, but they're very frustrated because after they consider all aspects and arrive at a decision and make a recommendation to the board completely ignores them, rethinks everything, and makes their own decision. How can you control it?
Well, I think you have to control it. Is the fastest way to discourage people from joining a committee and fracturing an organization.
Well, I guess in terms of how to control it, that strikes me that, one, you want to get everybody together in the same room and to have a leadership meeting of some kind where you get the board together with committee chairs and have a moment where everyone's aligned on what the organization is all about. You know, this goes back to the mission and the strategy for the groups. Folks should be aligned on where the organization is trying to go and where it fits together. If that situation keeps happening, where the committees want to go one way and the board wants to go another, somebody's not talking to somebody. And you know, what's so important in that case is to get the group together, talk about where they want to go, how they want to get there, and what the strategies are that would make that happen.
Agreed. You know, there is one more story that I'd love to share quickly, very quickly. I was working with an association board of directors in a country where associations are not particularly well established. And the participation by the board members in this association's board was completely funded by a government organization. And so everybody would come to the board meetings, but everybody felt like they had no ownership, they had no responsibility to make change happen or to actually do anything of any significance. They were just there to, like good students in the classroom. And so one day watching them, I met with them over several months. And at one board meeting, instead of doing it in a big fancy hotel with a lovely lunch and a cocktail hour, I pulled them into a factory warehouse where we took a bunch of furniture, mismatched tables from out of the warehouse area. So we had a board table with a bunch of tables pushed together that were all different sizes and shapes. And then we ringed it with 22 different random office chairs that we were able to find. And when they all came into the board meeting, they looked at me like I had lost my mind. And they said, "Why are we meeting here?" And I said, "Listen, guys, he who pays the price calls the agenda. And if you want to survive, if the government decides this is no longer a priority, is it a priority to you? Do you keep working with this? Or do you just say, okay, well, I guess it's not important anymore, we'll go home? Is this your association or is it somebody else's? And to my astonishment, they got it and began putting themselves in a position to continue to exist, whether or not there was outside funding for what they did, and bringing in, they raised that night, they raised $150,000, which was huge for them, just in people saying, yes, this is important to me. I'm not a puppet here, I'm a part of making change happen. It was really exciting. And I think you need to trick boards into being aware of what potential they have. So,
Nope, that's
Andy and Lisa. Andy and Lisa, thank you very much for your insights today. It has been a wonderful session. And just as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, and the video and slides will be posted to the virtual website Knowledge Hub very soon. And again, please take a few minutes to complete the survey that will pop up in your window just momentarily. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Lisa.
thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for making
Thanks all.
time.
Thanks for joining us.